JD Haltigan, welcome to the Accad and Koka report.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I've been a big fan of the report for a long time, and it's a pleasure to be with you. I'm very honored.
Great, we're delighted to have you. So, JD, the psychology of the pandemic response is the rage right now. Everybody's talking about mass formation, like we're all expert at it, and so we're happy to have you enlighten us on these considerations. But let's start by telling us where you are, what do you practice, and what your background is.
Sure. So my background is in actually psychology, more recently in some of the psychiatric field. So my background is a PhD in developmental psychology and a focus in understanding and studying developmental psychopathology more specifically, which is essentially just a fancy term for understanding mental illness, how the symptoms sort of coalesce and co-vary, modeling a lot of the psychopathology, symptomatology in adolescents and adults, and so trying to really understand across the lifespan how psychopathology emerges, as well as healthy development. And so with the I'd say last decade, really more since my graduate training, I've been mostly involved in doing a lot of methodological work on understanding how these symptoms emerge, how they express themselves phenotypically in humans, and it's been quite a journey. My early work was in attachment, so I come from an evolutionary developmental background, which I think helps to inform my understanding of psychopathology from that sort of mindset. So I finished my PhD at the University of Miami in 2009, and since then have been really sort of kind of all over the place, doing a lot of this research.
Very good. And you recently wrote, you have something to say about the pandemic response. You wrote a piece on your blog, your Substack blog, and we'll have a link to it in the on the show notes. Um, but tell us a little bit. I mean, give us some background about how you came to think about the psychology of the pandemic response.
Sure. So I've been, as I mentioned, my work has been quite a bit in developmental psychopathology. So I've been, even prior to the pandemic, studying symptoms like depression and anxiety, and more, more nuanced psychopathology or more rare psychopathology and schizophrenia, and so forth. But since the pandemic has, come upon us, I've kind of in real time on social media, but also in my daily life, witnessed the evolution of this response, not only in the population in terms of how individuals are responding to it differentially, but also how government leaders and administrators are responding to it, mostly here in the U.S. I'm between the U.S. and Canada, but mostly here in the U.S., but also in Canada in terms of restrictions, and how they encourage certain mandates or certain policy regarding masking, vaccinations. And it's really because it's dovetailed with a lot of what I've studied in terms of the reaction, in terms of how folks are reacting to it when you walk outside or when you walk into the grocery store and you see many people in masks and some not. It's just really made me think about a lot of what I studied prior to the pandemic in terms of how these symptoms express themselves in people. And so that's kind of what really led me to write the Substack post. And obviously here, especially here in the States, the debate is raging about masks and vaccinations, and it's really sort of front and center on social media. So it got me really thinking, and that's really what led to the Substack piece.
Mm-hmm.
To try to give to the public some way of understanding what's going on from an academic perspective.
Right. Let me try to frame a little bit the way I think all of us are thinking about this, or as something that requires an explanation. Meaning, all of us, and I think it doesn't matter what side you're in, so to speak, but we view the opposite reaction as unexplainable. I mean, we look at, for example, I look at what my sense of the data is and what I think the virus is, how it's impacting our lives, and I'm thinking, how in the world can people possibly think to do X, like mandating masks, or in kids, or even vaccines, or all these kind of things. And I think I mean, I imagine that the other side views people with my attitudes with the same kind of bewilderment, and and certainly those of us, I mean, Anish, you, most of the guests we've had on the show, think about the reaction to the pandemic as something that's really completely out of line to the reality, and we wonder how come people, people who are otherwise, clearly have demonstrated the ability to reason and cogitate and write eloquent things and reasonable things about different topics, can view this pandemic phenomenon with such a, in such a radically different way. So is that what we're trying to explain here? Is that we're trying to explain how the reactions to the same kind of situation that we're all involved in at some level in a similar way? How is it that we can react to it so differently?
Yeah, exactly. So one of the theories that I've done a lot of work with in terms of research is what's called Diathesis, the stress theory of psychopathology, and that actually emerged from the depression literature. And it's really what it is it's a theory about individual differences in reaction to environmental input. And of course, in this case, the environmental stimulus is the pandemic crisis. But the idea is that each one of us carries an inherent vulnerability factor or trait level of whatever symptomatology, such as depression or anxiety or sadness or fear. So we know from statistical modeling of psychopathology data that despite the fact that the public views mental illness largely as a categorical phenomenon, most disorders are distributed normally in the population in terms of the symptoms. All of us have a little bit or a lot of, and really what separates disorder from subthreshold symptomatology is how severe that expression gets. But we all have a sort of a set point threshold at which we express those symptoms. And when you have a stressor, like in this case, the obvious pandemic, each one of us will be sort of at a different threshold for expressing a lot of the symptoms that we've seen in the population, which have motivated some of the reactions. So the idea is that we all carry these latent vulnerabilities or set points to express given symptoms, and that depending on those, when we're presented with an environmental stimulus or a stressor, in this case, the diathesis gets expressed more readily or less readily in certain individuals. And so that's really, and that theory or that idea emerged principally from depression research early on. And so that's kind of, having done a lot of that work, that struck me as sort of one of the explanations for seeing what's going on in the population now, is that individuals who have a lower threshold for exhibiting symptomatology, or who are, tend to be more anxious or more fearful or more likely to panic, are going to be more likely to express those symptoms in the context of not just the reality biologically of the virus that can harm, but also the sort of media, mainstream media, social media ecosystem, which is amplifying the fear, which in much of the milieu is disproportionate to the actual risk of the virus. And the second aspect is sort of a levels problem, and that is methodologically, individuals will tend to look at, individual level data, mechanistic explanations for, like, for example, do masks work in sort of a artificial setting with mannequins, or looking at things at a population level. So what's happening is sort of a levels question, depending on how you see and frame the world, will also impact how you view policy and responses to a pandemic. So those two sort of prongs, one being this diathesis stress model, and the other being more of a methodological question between levels of looking at data individually or looking at data in the aggregate at the population, have really driven my interest in a lot of this.
Okay. Now, this diathesis stress model that you've described here, saying that people have different. I mean, it sounds very plausible that people would have different thresholds for, exhibiting certain traits or certain behaviors in response to a given stress. But how does that explain? I mean, you'd imagine that these different thresholds would be distributed randomly in the population, or how does it explain the fact that, we see sort of patterns of, academia reacting in a very strong way generally across the board, or the media reacting very strongly across the board, or certain political, right? I mean, the political divide, you have one side acting one way and the other side acting perhaps a little differently. Or different classes, socioeconomic classes. What do you make of that, of those patterns that we see, and how do you relate them to that model?
That's an excellent question. And so one of the things that I've kind of been looking into more in depth recently is, so for example, we know, and most practitioners know, that symptomatology of mental illness for certain psychopathologies are more common in one sex than another. So, for example, we know in adolescence, females tend to be have elevated levels of depression, anxiety, fear, and other trait neuroticism, personality. In males, it's different. We have more aggression, we have more externalizing, we have more antisocial, and those are sensible, plausible, biological correlates of mental illness in certain different age ranges when they're expressed more readily. In terms of how the public, so if you take those sort of basic ideas that for given mental illnesses or symptoms of mental illnesses, that they'll be expressed somewhat differentially across sexes at different points in the lifespan, when you ask the question about how the left and the right, for example, are reacting differently, or for example, in academia, it tends to be more of a panic-driven, really heightened anxiety response. My sort of interest has been driven to constructs in personality literature around masculinity, femininity, and so the idea here is that there is some evidence that, especially in the academic sector, but also as well, at least here in the States, politically left tend to track more with traits that express those symptoms more readily. And I've linked in the Substack piece, I linked one longitudinal cohort study that sort of shows that. And so some of the personality and behavioral traits that comprise these classes that we're noting are reacting with more, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it, just more of a hysteria-driven mentality. The traits of elevated levels of anxiety, elevated levels of fear, elevated levels of, for example, personality trait neuroticism will track to certain degrees more strongly with those classes than they will with sort of the more right-leaning classes. So it is an interesting way of looking at it, because as you mentioned here in the States, at least on the right, if you take it all the way to the extreme on the right, they're totally anti-vax and what have you. So it's more of a stoic kind of response. And so that's where my research and interest has kind of taken me, is to explain why we're seeing such a divergent pattern of reaction to the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And going to the levels question, just one last thing is that individuals will who have sort of more of an emotional response will tend to see data at an individual level rather than at a population level. So any life lost is tragic, but they will tend to focus on that and ignore the population reality that to get beyond the pandemic, there will be unfortunately some life lost, but in the grand scheme of things, in the aggregate, the most benefit will accrue if we focus on the population and do what we can to target the most at risk and protect them. And certainly we care about every life, but we have to look at the broader picture.
That's interesting because my instinct would be to say that it's actually the left tends to think about things in the aggregate level, meaning in the abstract, right? I mean, socialism and its varieties and of tends to think in sort of utilitarian uh, um, terms and view things on a population level as opposed to the right, at least the traditional right, which would talk about principles about how we take care of each other individually, that sort of thing. But um, so I mean, do you think there's a nuance there to tease out or?
Yeah, I definitely think there is looking into it with a fine tooth comb in the sense of I think the stressor in this case is really the interesting piece is that the stressor in this case is a virus, so it's sort of a mechanism that will instill some sort of fear, or we have to eliminate the virus or protect from illness and death. Whereas in other cases, the stressor or the element that sort of separates the left and the right politically, ideologically, is not necessarily a virus that threatens health and mental well-being. So I think there is some nuance to unpack there as to, we have sort of, I think one of the things about individuals more on the left is the collectivist mentality that we need to protect everybody. But if that's driven largely by fear at a disproportionate level, it becomes, in a way, at the extreme, authoritarianism with lockdowns and mandates. And it loses the focus on the population in the sense of we can't focus on each individual protecting them at the expense of a population who needs to move beyond the pandemic, or at least be able to handle it in a way that allows everybody individually the ability to move about, to live their life, and to ideally have those liberties
Mm-hmm.
freely expressed.
Okay. No, I understand. Now, uh, let's let's try to view it from the other side's perspective. For example, I mean, it seems obvious to you and me that the responses have been draconian and that sort of thing. But on the other hand, I'm sure the people on the other side who defend those responses think that their anxiety is not actually an anxiety. It's an appropriate fear or an appropriate assessment of what the danger the virus represents, and and that right, that their worldview is the correct one. So in your scheme of diathesis, stress response or whatnot, I mean, is there how do you tell who's right or who's wrong? I mean, what's the arbiter of what's the correct response? Because you could have a very negative complacency, right? I mean, if you're completely complacent about the danger, then it's going to be dysfunctional or abnormal or pathological in a way. So fear is healthy under the right circumstances. And how do we determine whether the current circumstances justify the fear or not?
Right, and I think in my Substack piece, I talk a little bit about the idea of balanced regulation and balanced emotionality in terms of handling the pandemic. So, I lay out the strategies and the response has to be proportional to the risk. And in the case of what we're seeing now, especially in the states where we have an interesting scenario where each different type of state, whether you're blue or you're red, you're seeing sort of differential responses. And some of that, if you look closely and just sort of at an observational level, I haven't run any statistics on this or anything of that nature, but there will be some evidence, I think, that it tracks by biological sex. So females will tend to respond more with safety measures or measures that focus on protection, care, emotionality. We have to protect, whereas males tend to be the other way a little bit. They focus on moving beyond that without excessive restrictions. New York City comes to mind with Kathy Hochul a little bit. Certainly in Boston, there were similar cases. And you mentioned also academia. If you look at some of the schools where some of these draconian restrictions have been put in place, I think Cornell was one, Princeton another, the individuals that are putting them in place tend to track more biologically in terms of sex female than male. Not exclusively, of course, but that will tend to appear, and that makes good sense given that we know that females tend to express those symptoms more readily in general in the aggregate. So I think you have to sort of balance the two perspectives, of course, and that means, as I lay out, at least in terms of the response to the pandemic here in the States, we want to encourage recognition, obviously, first and foremost, that we've dealt with something real. So nobody is denying that this is a real pandemic. Certainly, we want to encourage vaccinations and those who are at risk. I know there's been a lot of debate, which I focused less on, about the vaccinations and efficacy and so forth, but certainly encourage. But I think mandating is a step too far. And certainly, with the masking and currently now with the Omicron, which we're seeing as a less risky variant, and we're seeing what appears to be, from some of the early data, suggestive of the pandemic going into its waning stages with a less virulent strain, if you will, even though it's more readily transmissible. We have to balance sort of the, I guess, masculine and feminine perspectives on this so that we're not really disproportionate to one side or the other. And right now, especially in the elite classes, it is disproportionate. And we're seeing that especially across state lines and so forth. So that's one of the interesting elements from an evolutionary perspective that I've been interested in terms of how does the managerial class respond to the pandemic, and how are these, diatheses expressed differentially in the classes, but more specifically in the biological sexes that comprise the class.
Do you think the political class is overly feminized?
I do. I mean, I will have to say, at least in terms of the Democratic Party now, I've been an independent all my life, certainly voted both ways, but certainly there's what I've really highlighted repeatedly, and this is even irrelevant to the pandemic, but just in terms of academia as it currently is with other issues, we have a drastic asymmetry in the institutions of higher learning, where it is, I want to look for a softer way of putting it than feminized, because it evokes some sort of negative sexist sort of trope, but it's really just stating the obvious that we have elevated levels of the traits that track with one sex. And when you have a disproportionate share at such magnitude, there will be consequences, and we're seeing some of that play out, and that's concerning at multiple levels, not just with the pandemic response, but at multiple levels in terms of the inability to have liberal debate and some of the other stuff that we're seeing happening in higher education.
Let me, before I turn it over to Anish, there's one other observation that perhaps you can comment on. Just today, I had in my office a patient who clearly had a very, very severe anxiety reaction to the vaccine, and you see that. So you see that in the camp that is against lockdowns. They're not necessarily totally complacent or comfortable or stoic about everything, and I observe a lot of very strong fear reaction to the vaccine that to me seems also disproportionate. I mean, it's understandable because there's the question of trust, and they've lost trust in the institutions that produce these vaccines. But nevertheless, I mean, there's quite a bit of what I think is you know, on the one hand, ill-informed, but on the other hand, bordering on the irrational fear of what the vaccines can do and will do to people. And if that's the case, then um, this trait of anxiety. I mean, I don't know how do you parse that out. Also, I mean, because it seems to be there's some anxiety on this side as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that sort of made me think a lot too. And I think in terms of the vaccine fear, extreme fear of vaccination, I think I rely on or sort of fall back on my evolutionary explanations a little bit more for that. So in the case of the vaccinations, assuming it's a legitimate, genuine fear and not sort of just more of a display of ideology mindset, I think you have to think about the vaccinations from the standpoint of you are putting into your body something that is foreign and artificial in the sense of it's created, versus on the other hand, fearing the consequences of getting COVID, which, the virus is sort of natural in the environment, and we all are exposed to viruses on a daily basis, not just COVID, but many. So we, even prior to COVID, there were plenty. So in that sense, what's the more rational fear? One in which we would be putting something foreign into our body, or one in which we were exposed to something relatively normative in the environment in terms of, a virus? And to me, while I haven't thought about it deeply, the more rational fear would seem to be the vaccine, rather than fearing a virus, which we've dealt with throughout human history for long periods of time. And that's sort of more just an observation I've made, but it is something you point out that is quite an interesting point for me to think through, because it's not clear cut, and none of this is clear cut. Obviously, we're looking at aggregate level data and making some sort of more broad-based observations. But in the case of what we're dealing with now, I think you have to understand the phenomenon.
Good. I have many more questions, but I want to let Anish jump in here if you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much, JD. Very interesting. Your Substack article was super interesting. The one point I was wanted to make was that you described how in this model that as you increase the amount of stress on an individual, certain people break down, certain people with certain traits break down, whereas resilient individuals kind of stay strong, if you will, and therefore have a good outcome, correct?
Right, or they stay strong. They're resilient, so they're less likely to phenotypically express the symptoms in sort of a more forward way. They might still have them, but they're resilient to the sense that they can handle them and adaptively.
Right. So how would you say, so, and we're all talking here about the kind of seemingly hyper anxious person, public health person who gets on Twitter who, is feeding into some irrational, which I think most people, even on the left, would agree would be irrational fear. So, I think there was just today, for instance, there was in Houston, I believe, this is a report at least, a high school teacher was pulled over and cited by the police for having her 13-year-old in the trunk of her car. And that was because, so she was driving around, or she went through a drive-through with a 13-year-old in the trunk of her car or something to that effect. And it was because the child tested positive for COVID. So she was quarantining the child by keeping the child in the trunk of the car. And this was this was a high school teacher. And so clearly, there's another case that there's this irrational fear. And this is what I think nicely you're describing in terms of folks who seemingly have kind of broken down or kind of decompensated with this additional layers of stress, correct? But
Yeah, and I've seen this. I think social media especially has a tendency to amplify that for sure. And so I've seen, as you've mentioned on social media, especially Twitter, some of the public health officials, it's almost so extreme that you wonder if it's really real. And that's really concerning, because when you have people in positions of institutional authority, especially in the public health setting, conveying such
yeah,
extreme levels that are so disconnected from the actual reality,
right.
it misinforms the public in a way that is egregious, in terms of
Yeah, and
how
then
to
it
think
leads.
about
Yeah,
the virus, number one, but also how, I can't help myself, but when I walk through the store here in Pittsburgh and look at the patrons, I really do get the sense, and this could certainly be my bias, but I do get the sense that a lot of the individuals who rely on these authorities have been misled into feeling a way that perhaps they wouldn't otherwise fear if they had someone who was more balanced, providing them with more accurate level information. That
right. And
that
so,
is
right. So two questions. One is that, if you told me a year and a half ago that public health messaging over the course of the 18 months could make parents afraid of their children, would make parents view their children as disease-carrying vectors to be quarantined, I would have said this is impossible. This cannot happen. Have there and but it seems like we are. I mean, that very well seems to be what's happening. That people are terrified of their children. I mean, I don't. Has something like this type of mass? There's a significant portion of the population that's like this, um, and I think most people, even the public health folks that are want children in N95s, etc. Even those folks who I've conversed with privately on direct message, when I tell them about parents that are afraid of their children because they now have COVID, parents that are healthy, vaccinated, and boosted, right? Their child gets COVID and they're afraid of their vaccinated, boosted child to the point that they don't want to take care of them, or to the point that they need to get the child, or they're not. I mean, you've kind of broken what evolutionarily it seems like has been going on forever. Like, I mean, I could never imagine this. So it seems like we're in the grip of some mass mass psychosis. And I know this is a very oft used term now. Have you seen something like this happen before historically?
no, and that's, you bring up a good point, and I want to. Two things come to mind as you were talking there, and one is the mass formation concept, which has been thrown about on the internet. Matthias Desmond, who's kind of articulated that at a more broad population level, but also with the you mentioned specifically parents and mothers in particular who have been completely reacting in a way that is extreme. And so my two things that I want to say about that is, one, the pandemic and the social media ecosystem has really sort of, I think, hijacked normative instincts, especially on the part of caregivers, but in terms of female caregivers, naturally they're going to be very worried about their child. We know this from developmental psychology. That's a normative expression of healthy mothering, or even in the case of, if it was a father, you would expect some of the same, although maybe not as elevated. But when you have a social media ecosystem that is spewing excessive hysteria, it's easy to see how in some, or in a majority of cases, this could be hijacked to then in turn create what you just described, was some parents and mothers in particular have really unfortunately been led to believe that the situation is so severe that they've taken measures that are so drastic that defy all logical reasoning and all logical sensibility. And
That's
it's
the
kind of, it's unfortunate to see, but I think a lot of the blame is on some of the public health officials that have continually, incessantly driven the panic and the hysteria, especially around children too, because as we know with the N95s, the KN95s now, we know that most of the literature has shown that the children are not efficient disease vectors and transmissibility, that the actual virus is less severe and less dangerous to them. So I think a lot of the blame is there. And then in terms of more broadly, Desmond's idea, he's seeing things from a larger population scale, but you have to remember too, even prior to the pandemic, and also, specifically here in the West, but in the States in particular, there was a lot of social fragmentation, politically, ideologically, but even broadly in the cultural milieu. We're in a different world now where everyone is on social media. It's less community-based. Everyone's sort of in their little cubicle. And so the conditions for something like a mass formation episode to occur, when it's in fact facilitated by institutional authorities, is very plausible to me. And the actual mechanistic really reason for that is diathesis of stress.
Yeah. So the other point, well, let me not let go of that. Let me just continue on this for just a brief little segue, is that there's this historically something called the dancing plague of 1518. My wife told me about this. It's this it was a dance epidemic. It was a case of dancing mania that occurred in somewhere in France. And basically what happened is that a woman began to dance fervently on a street, and soon she was joined by multiple people. And the story is, this may be myth, but there were these all mostly women. Multiple of them died dancing to their death for multiple days. And this started in July, ended in September. And physicians had to intervene by hospitalizing the afflicted to get them to stop dancing. It's very interesting. There's some interesting stories about whether or not the bite of a venomous spider made them dance in order to make them feel better, and that's why. But anyway, the point is, it is one of these things that's regarded as this strange social contagion that kind of came and went. And I wonder if 100 years from now, what's going on now may be similarly viewed. But in the other, in terms of, as you increase the stress on individuals, what decisions are they making, and are they going to get a good outcome? It is easy for at least the three of us to talk about the folks that are maybe have irrational fear or doing kind of strange things. But what do you make of the other side, where you have say the immunosuppressed, overweight, low socioeconomic status child that is clearly a setup and at high risk for getting severely ill from a number of different viruses, and of course, SARS-CoV-2 is one of those viruses that is circulating at very high levels now, and it's novel, and it poses a significant risk to that child. Yet, and this is just for the children. Even adults say the very overweight, out of shape male with diabetic, who also has history of lung disease and smoked for many years, right? Relatively speaking, what we would say unhealthy individuals that are at high risk if they were to contract this virus, correct? Now, it wouldn't be wrong to say that those folks are being resilient by refusing vaccination, correct?
Right. I mean, you would hope that those individuals who are most at risk would in fact accept the vaccination. Is that what you're asking?
Right. Yeah. So what is this? Is it a similar? I mean, is it a similar thing that's driving them to not make the right decision in that particular case, or what many at least the consensus?
Well, I guess in terms of the immunosuppressed and those who have
corners.
high risk factors that are choosing not to get vaccinated,
The right decision would be in the vaccine.
Yeah, but I guess I wasn't aware of a trend to point to that. But in that case, you would have to wonder why, especially in the case of, given their increased risk factors, they're so fearful of the vaccination. So it does lead me to kind of wonder why that might be.
Right. I would say also that it's harder um, to make a judgment about the rationality of a decision when it involves the individual person, as opposed to the people who have an opinion that everybody should do X or mask or not mask or right. So I mean, if you have a person that individually wants to prefer to take a chance without the vaccine, or prefer the odds of being exposed to a natural virus and whatnot, as JD was mentioning earlier, that it's maybe different from what we were talking about with this trying to explain with this diathesis stress model, sort of explain sort of a population based reaction to an environment, to a stressor that triggers sort of a very broad sort of social response. Am I? Is that correct or?
Yeah, I think, but we have to understand too that there will be individual differences in diathesis stress. So even though some people might have a larger diathesis to expressing these traits, they may in fact do okay. So it's sort of more of an aggregate level explanation. Um, but getting back to the question of, you know, everybody has an opinion on what everybody should do versus the individual who wants to make their own choice. And I think
Right.
in that case, it really comes down to appropriate public health messaging. So, obviously we want to encourage the immunocompromised, the overweight, the risk factors to really uptake the vaccine. But when you get right down to it, the question of should you force them to or let them choose on their own, that really gets into sort of a discussion that is really an ethical one, I guess. Not only in terms of politically how you want to govern a society where you have to make decisions that not only impinge upon that person, but potentially in this case on others who might contract the disease. That's really at the heart of a lot of what's happening now in the culture, and so I have to I go back to when Joe Rogan got in trouble for saying a healthy young male who otherwise has no complications, if that person chooses not to get vaccinated, that didn't seem like all that absurd a statement to me. But yet he was crucified for saying that, because in large part, I think the idea, or at least one of the arguments against him, was that, well, they could infect other people. But it still, again, it illustrates, I think, a lot of how balanced, nuanced discussion is almost impossible right now.
Yeah,
So
and it's JD brings up one last thing about that. JD, your background, because I grew up in Pittsburgh as well, and so that tall black building there is the U.S. Steel building.
Currently
It
the
was
UPMC building.
right, right. The U.S. Steel built it in I believe it was the 1970s, and for the longest time it had, I think USX was on the top of it,
Correct.
and reflecting the change of the city, Pittsburgh being a blue collar town, a manufacturing town, soot all over the place, gray, and over time, the city has transitioned from a blue collar manufacturing town with a very different culture to now be a healthcare town. I think healthcare is the biggest employer. The U.S. Steel still is, I think U.S. Steel and UPMC now are the two biggest tenants of the U.S. Steel building, but the naming rights were changed to UPMC. So UPMC is now on the tallest building in Pittsburgh. So it's interesting that uh, um, our response to, and this is true of many cities across the United States in terms of manufacturing going away and healthcare, et cetera, growing to the fore. So despite the fact that we've poured ever more dollars into healthcare than we've ever done before, it's probably safe to say that our response now is far less resilient to this pandemic than any societies prior, despite the fact that we supposedly are much more advanced and are much more health focused than we are before. You wrote another Substack about the change in your town, because you're also, or at least if you're basically a Pittsburgh native at this point. Can you talk a little bit about how Pittsburgh has changed?
Well, yeah, and I will say that I grew up actually I was born in Baltimore, Maryland, grew up in Washington, D.C., but my family roots, more or less, I'd like to say, are from Pittsburgh, and I would always travel here as a kid. And eventually, after my dad retired, they moved back here. So that's currently where we live now, where I sort of have my second office, if you will, in between Toronto and Pittsburgh. But I did write that Substack piece because it is striking to me. As a kid, I would come here and it was more blue collar manufacturing, and now it is more healthcare. And some of the same neighborhoods that I would trope through as a kid and watch my uncles and aunts play softball have completely changed in terms of not just racial and ethnic demographics, but in terms of the personality characteristics that I see, displayed. And again, of course, I'm coming with my own bias at this, but you mentioned the change from blue collar steel mill to healthcare. And one of the things that when you look at and you zoom out, what does healthcare sort of select for? It selects for more personality types that are caring, that are more empathetic, whereas the blue collar steel industry, on the other hand, is sort of almost orthogonal to that in a sense of just, get go routine to the steel mill, pour the molten steel, very systematic. And so what you want, obviously, is you want to have in any real region or body of governance sort of a balance between what I like to refer to from the ASD autism literature, trait systemization and trait empathization. But when you have such a shift from a blue collar manufacturing systemization based sort of mindset or personality type to a disproportionately healthcare, elite, educational, abstract society that's totally driven more by the feeling states or the emotional states or the empathetic states, that has consequences at scale. And so while healthcare is meant to be, caring for the individual, that's obviously a good thing. But when you have a pandemic that affects the population, an excessive focus on the individual can lose its sort of ability to be a good thing. It can actually become sort of an inefficient way of dealing with something that needs to be dealt with at an aggregate sort of, I don't want to say faceless level, but more of a mindset that focuses less on the individual and more on the needs of the population rather than each individual. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of where we are. And that sort of gets at the name of public health. It's a population level issue with something like a virus, as opposed to somebody coming into the ER with a broken arm, where obviously the care must be on that broken arm in that moment.
So if we want to summarize a little bit the conversation here and the points that you've touched on, shall we say that there is, to explain this pandemic response phenomenon that we're observing, you say that there's been sort of a trend over the last decades, maybe many decades, of favoring, I wouldn't say selecting for, because I think it seems to be a cultural thing. So I don't know that you can apply the biological selection model to explain that. But certainly there's been and I'm going to use the term feminization just because it's shorthand. So the feminization of our preoccupations and therefore of our of how we react to things with the traits that you've described, these more empathetic traits and more caring traits and whatnot. And those have become more prominent in certain institutions like academia and maybe the political class and so forth. And as a result, when you have something like a pandemic to come about, then you have this massive sort of massively anxious response that is seems to be disproportionate to the actual threat. Um, Now, I think that has a lot of plausibility to it. Is that sort of fair as a really quick 1 minute summary, JD?
Yeah, no, that's
Okay.
entirely fair. And I would say that in one other fine-tuned point is that in the case of, I'm not a political historian by any stretch of the imagination, but when you scale that to models of political governance and ideological battles, empathy can be weaponized quite readily in a situation like this. And I think,
That's right.
you know,
So that brings up the point that I wanted to make is um, that I mean it can't just be that as the explanation, as sort of a natural evolution of the culture that leads us to, I mean there's the conspiratorial sort of angle where people and groups sort of taking advantage of the situation to their own benefit. And I think there's plausibility to that, to thinking that the media has an interest in propagating the porn or the panic porn that people talk about. That the political classes in to some extent have an interest also in propagating the fear for their own purposes. Um, right. So there's that too, and um, to factor in. But one thing that I wanted to bring up also is see how you would explain how would you explain China in its very drastic response. I mean, do you think that China? I mean, would you use the same sort of psychological explanation? I mean, it seems that it'd be hard to invoke the kind of feminization that has taken place in Western societies, to invoke that as a mechanism to explain the very harsh lockdowns that the Communist Party has imposed on China.
yeah, no, that's a good point. I think one of the things that comes to mind, a little bit of the work or a little bit of the research that I've kind of read into, is that in China they've locked down. It's sort of a more totalitarian mindset, and it does. I would not think of an overly feminization explanation for that particular case, nor in Australia either, where they've had severe lockdowns and NPI mandates and so forth. But here in the case of the West, I think the feminization drives the phenotypic response of anxiety and fear. But you have to also think who's at the top of these institutions that are sort of, in a way, taking advantage of those who follow them, who express these anxiety and fear-based mechanisms, to then impose their totalitarian lockdowns or their more severe restrictions. So it's more of a, even though the West has become, I think, feminized to some degree in these classes, it's the people at the top that then leverage that overt reaction that is associated with feminization to then act more totalitarian in a way. So it's sort of a, in China they don't have the sort of fear-based response that you're seeing, but in terms of the West, it's the same people at the top that are taking advantage of what's being expressed by a certain class more readily. So you have these people in media that's fearmonger and panic porn, but the people that are actually responsible for driving that, who then take advantage of, like Anish just mentioned the case in Houston, they're the more, autocratic types that want to use that to their advantage. And that's just my sort of off the cuff thinking on that.
Anish?
Well, what if you can marry the two responses, not the two responses, China, Australia, New Zealand, what I think half the country wants to do in the United States, by putting it in in Christopher Lash's framework, which JD, you I know are a student of both Christopher Lasch and William Reef, right?
Philip Reef, yes.
Philip Reef, sorry. And Christopher Lasch, he kind of turned the phrase "revolt of the masses" on its head and discussed about the revolt of the elites. Correct?
That's correct.
Where the chief threat, in another age, in the age of the Bolshevik Revolution, the concern in terms of keeping a stable society and keeping civilization in order was keeping those the teeming unwashed masses down. And how do you do that? But now the chief threat seems to come from those at the top of the social hierarchy, not the masses. um, so whether you're looking so the whether you're looking in China, New Zealand, Australia, wherever you're looking at, the reason every place has the same general instinct is because it's an elite class of folks that think the same way, that are completely cocooned from reality, even more so now than when Christopher Lasch wrote his book in the 1970s, right? Now with Zoom and the internet and laptops, etc. Correct. So perhaps that is kind of what binds all these together, is that this elite class that is unplugged from reality, that kind of wants their way and is acting in a self-interested manner.
Yeah, I think it's a sociological explanation that makes complete sense and is very plausible. As a student of Lasch, I mean, he wrote prior to Revolt of the Elites, the culture of narcissism, and narcissism is another personality trait that tracks with some of the stuff that we're seeing. And they're totally disconnected from the normal population. And not just with the pandemic, but with other issues, you cannot functionally run a society at the scale of the US where you try to normalize a reaction or a condition that is, statistically non-normal. It's just not going to work, or it's going to result in continued fragmentation, and I said on another podcast, balkanization, which is what we're already clearly seeing evidence of here in the States, with people fleeing New York and going to Florida, people fleeing California and going to Texas. I mean, while they're isolated incidents, I think that's starting to happen with more scale, and that fragmentation or that balkanization is not a good thing. I mean, for the health of the country as a unified nation. And so, I think one of the things that binds these things is this elite class that is totally, unhinged from the normal population. And I will say that, there are members of the elite class that have blue collar roots that, need to step up and I think push back, but it's so difficult to do that in today's climate because you're immediately cast off, as in the case of the pandemic. You're a psychopath, you don't care about children or those who are suffering. But when you don't have an ability to have any liberal discourse, there's no way to have a functional response that is actually reflective of a balanced reaction to something like the pandemic.
Right. And so, part of it, I think part of the issue, you have folks that are in such sway, and certainly in, even in Australia, there's a significant portion of the populace that actually is going along with anything that is coming down from the top, is that there's, the new god appears to be, this technocratic, medical class of experts. And they've basically, I think we've been trained and inculcated for many decades now to believe that any significant questions that face society can be answered by this expert class of people. I mean, I think there's a large group of people that believe that. And so, and these substantive questions can be left to these experts, and these experts, and the reason for that is because these experts have access to knowledge, and their training at whatever institutions they're at, that kind of make them immune from many of the prior biases that people kind of, frown upon. The prior biases being, religion, or, a Western centric, Eurocentric, ideology or whatnot. Correct. We've now
Or
replaced.
patriarchy, yeah.
Yeah, we've now replaced. So I think we've been schooling people for a very long time through our institutions of education, whether it be from K through 12 to college, to believe in this technocratic class of folks. I think one of the most telling things for me, and I know, was my reaction when Jon Stewart went on to the old CNN show called Crossfire. Do you remember this? I don't know if you do. It's Crossfire was a show on CNN.
I remember Crossfire, but I don't. Yeah, I
Yeah.
definitely remember.
And the show Crossfire was, it had a Democrat operative and a Republican operative. And since there were no Republican operatives ever, it was Tucker Carlson. It was a young Tucker Carlson in a bow tie, right? And it was, I forget who the Democrat guy is. He's an affable guy who's super Democrat. And they would bring up issues, and basically Tucker Carlson and this Democrat operative would yell at each other, right? So one from the Republican side and one from the Democrat side, right? And and it would make for these clips of people yelling at each other and getting upset at each other. And then they invited Jon Stewart on once. Jon Stewart came on and basically said, "This is a ridiculous show, because instead of yelling about things from the right side and yelling about things from the left side, you guys are making America worse. You know what you need to do? You need to just take these questions and take them to the smartest guys in the world at Harvard." I'm paraphrasing. Or the smartest guys in the world at Yale, right? Take this question. You want to fix healthcare for all? You want to fix how do we give cheap, affordable healthcare to all? This yelling at each other from two sides of the political spectrum isn't going to do it. It's making things worse. You know what you should do? You need to take this to the Harvard intellectuals. They're smart. They'll figure it out. Yeah. And when I watched that as a young man, I think I was in med school or something, I was like, absolutely, Jon Stewart. This is exactly correct. This is what we should be doing. This is what's wrong with American politics. And actually, the CNN, the person who owned CNN at the time, agreed with Jon Stewart and ended the show because of what Jon Stewart went on. And it's famous for Jon Stewart going on and ending Crossfire, and I think many people still consider it. But in the end of the day, Jon Stewart was exactly wrong, right? You cannot settle the most important substantive questions of the day by giving it to some group of experts who have a bunch of technical knowledge. Number one, as it's obvious from COVID, their technical knowledge is far from good, is far from proficient. Their ability to critically analyze, for whatever reason, is terrible for many of them. And then number two, many of these things don't fall in the realm of some scientific expert technocracy.
But that's the paradox of democracy. Yeah, because who's gonna make the decisions if it's not the technocrats? Uncle Joe or or the voters? I mean, it ends up being that way just because it's natural. I mean, there has to be an elite making decisions, and in a democratic system, is going to be a technocratic elite. Now,
the problem
don't disagree. I don't disagree with anything you say, but their very limited ability to adjudicate these questions, but
right.
But I don't see another way.
No, well, but the problem is we've replaced it's the scientific technocrat elite that exists.
We need to bring
now.
back the King George. We made a mistake.
the democracy is not self-sustaining. Democracy only ends in the monarchy.
Right.
Anyway,
very good, JD. You've given us a lot of food for thoughts about you're a scientist. You're a developmental psychology scientist, about the mechanisms of what we're observing and whatnot. Do you do any therapeutics? Do you have
therapeutics? My therapeutics are getting outside during the pandemic and trying to do some way to jump rope. And I think as sort of a final point, I mean, that's one of the things that has totally been missed or underplayed is in this pandemic and lockdowns, and even with the risk factor of obesity, is really, focusing on that, and it's been lost. But my therapeutics are to get outside and try to get away from the computer as frequently as I can, because we're in a world now where it's pretty much 90 to 100% virtual.
I endorse this message. But if you go outside, just listen to the Accad and Koka on your favorite podcast.
Absolutely. I totally have really learned so much, particularly from the last more recent podcast with the Abaluk Bangladesh mass study with Viral and certainly with Tracy's latest. Such fantastic discourse. And I think this is, Anisha's point now where, it's a crossfire type platform, not necessarily with maybe the sort of heated debate of a crossfire, but different views are expressed. And, at the end of the day, yes, somebody has to make a decision, and you don't want things to get intractable with just screaming and shouting from two sides, but you want to have discourse that has that for at least a little bit of time to distill the truth or to distill the best approach. Whereas now in the institutions where these decisions are made, you don't have that sort of crossfire at all. You just have one ideological viewpoint and the others are shut down. And that's problematic when the ones that are shut down are more reflective of probably the majority of the population.
JD Haltigan, thank you very much. Where can people follow you? What's your Substack and your Twitter handle?
Twitter handle is JD Haltigan. So JD and then just my last name, Haltigan, and that will take you to a link for my Substack. And from there, I'm sure people can find my faculty bio page and so forth. But I'm trying to really use Twitter as a way to inform the public and engage in discourse. And certainly that's how I've met so many people that I've met on Twitter in terms of knowledge. It's just been phenomenal. I've learned so much from everybody. So it's been, even though it is a little bit of a unique place, I've definitely learned a lot there.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, JD.
Thanks so much.